Hi and welcome to another episode of MTV, Monsta TV. Thanks for joining me, Chief Monsta. And today we're going to talk about common paint problems that we have been hearing about from customers. Customers ringing up and also emailing through asking about questions on how to fix problems or seeing problems and trying to inquire what they are. So there's 4 common problems that we've been gauging from the public. And the first one we come up across is cracking and flaking paint. So there's a couple of things that can cause cracking and flaking paint. Firstly, quality of the paint you use. Very, very important. I know that we talk about our paints and other paints in general, but if you pick a cheap product or a nasty one and it may not perform as you want, this is probably a result of what it is. It's just the reality. If it's the old saying, you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. So really when you're at the selection phase, a good quality paint will avoid it. The other thing is thinning of paint. I do know there are some paint companies out there, and I know the old days, those of you who are a bit old school, that have used oil-based paints, that you may come across where you would thin a solvent paint with things like turpentines, etc. Some try and do that with water-based paints and thin it with water. That actually affects the quality of the paint. So really important that when you are painting, don't go and try and dilute it. A clean brush, sometimes the brush roller might be slightly damp, but then what you do is just make sure that that's in a non-wet state. Start to use the product as it is, no dilution, and that will avoid the cracking and flaking issue. Surface preparation, we have spoken about this before, it is so important, and it will come up with a lot of these problems, but particularly with cracking and flaking paint. If you have a surface that's not prepared properly, likely is the paint won't bond too well, it will impact adhesion, and that's a common cause. The other one is particularly for external conditions, but sometimes inside, but windy conditions. Okay, you get a warm wind and it starts to dry very, very quickly and can affect the paint. Or if you're inside, you might be in cool conditions, a cool day, you've got the air conditioner on, and that warm wind, particularly if you're doing ceilings or walls with the air conditioner ducts, that can affect the way the paint dries naturally. So really important to take that into consideration. So what do you do if you've got cracking or flaking paint? This is the important piece. If the cracking doesn't go down to the substrate, to the surface, it's just superficial on the surface of the paint, sand it to a feathered edge. So you got to remove all the loose and cracked paint first with a scraper, and just sand that paint down to a feathered edge. What is remaining on the wall, that's really important. Once you've done that, then you prime with our prep seal, which is it's here, there, our prep seal. Prime with prep seal, and that will ensure that you get good adhesion of the new repair paint on top of the areas that you've removed. However, if you find the cracking and flaking paint after you've taken the cracked paint off, and you've actually got the cracks that go right down to the surface, you're going to have to remove the paint entirely. Sand down, scraper, heat gun, give it a really good clean, wipe down, prep seal, and then start your paint job. So cracking and flaking paint, you can avoid it, but if you've got it there, that's something to be aware of. Second common problem that we hear about is mold. Now people have asked about mold. This comes up a lot in bathrooms and laundries and wet areas in general, but sometimes in internal areas. Causes of mold. Look, obviously where you've got damp conditions, or you've got rooms where there's very little sunlight that comes in. The other thing is where there's little ventilation is obviously the cause, or can be the cause. Again, the use of low quality paints, particularly those that don't have a fungicide or antibacterial property, antifungal property, which we spoke about the other week with our quality of paints. That is a real important one. And also, if you've had mold and you thought you just wipe it down and you then go and paint over it again, the mold spores will come through the new paint and that will still create an issue. So you've got to remove it, which we'll talk about in a minute, how you do that. And the other one, which people overlook often, but they might leave a paintbrush or a roller in a bucket of water where they think it's being kept moist and clean, and what actually happens is if that's left more than 24 hours, particularly outside, you can actually have mold starting inside the bucket within the water, some bacteria, that gets into the brush or the roller, you start to roll that out and you affect all the paint that you're rolling out. So that's why clean rollers and brushes are key. So if you've got mold on a wall, what you need to do firstly is remove it, and you can remove that with something as simple as White King, household bleach, 1 part 3 parts water, and give it a good clean. You've got to get rid of the mold. You don't just get rid of the surface area, but you've got to get the spores killed. Make sure you don't use outdoor cleaners inside. A lot of them are out in the market, like sodium hypochlorite, very strong chlorinated products. They will really impact your chest. If you've got breathing problems, you might end up with an ambulance at home. So don't go down that path. Make sure you use just a general bleach and good cleaner and get rid of the mold that way. Once you've done that, let the mold, the areas you've cleaned, dry properly. That's key. Okay, so just let it dry naturally, or get a hairdryer and blow over it so the surface is dry, and then commence your job with a good paint like one of our Monsta range, which has got the anti-bac properties in there, and there'll be mold gone forever. Peeling paint, it's another problem. We have seen that a lot. It is different than the cracking and flaking problem I mentioned earlier. Peeling paint is often due to poor adhesion of the paint to the surface, and there could be a number of reasons for that. As we mentioned before, inadequate surface preparation is one. The other one is surface dust and residues. Now, I know we like to get into the job and we think we might be putting a primer or a prep seal on the wall, but the issue is that whether you're working inside or outside, if you've got any surface dust on the walls and you then coat over it, the paint is bonding to the dust particles. And so if you actually do a peel test later, the paint comes off very, very easily. Whereas if you've cleaned it well, that you should not be able to remove paint off a wall, and if it's peeling, it's likely that is, especially a new job, it's likely that's what's affected it. The other key is when you're doing kitchen renos. A lot of kitchen renos where people are painting, you may have cleaned the surface, but you don't realise that over the years of actually frying things, you get spurts of oil on the wall, and it leaves like a grease residue on the surface. Now you may clean that down with water, but if you haven't removed that oily residue and you paint over it, again the paint's bonded to that oil residue and it'll peel. So ensure you get a degreaser, and the degreasers you use must be a degreaser that actually is biodegradable, washes out with water. Because what will happen is that will then sponge off and wipe off quite easily. If you use an oil-based degreaser, it pushes the oil back into the surface and you're never getting rid of it. So something to consider there. If you've got any questions on that, our Monsta crew can help you with more answers to guide you there. Again, the timber is another one that can create peeling problems. Timbers often require to be sealed and undercoated first. There are some timbers, real sensitive ones with certain tannins in there. You may need a special timber primer, but 9 times out of 10, a primer seal or undercoat like our prep seal, you apply to timber and that will avoid peeling paint off of timber surfaces, and that's particularly on your skirtings, doors, trims, frames, etc. And the other culprit of peeling paint is when you apply it to a surface that may be damp, or second coats over the first coat that haven't dried properly. Okay, very important. You need to let things in nature take their course, and they need to happen naturally in terms of the drying phase. So if you try and get onto a paint coat real quick and it hasn't really dried, you'll either pick up the first coat or you might find the second coat's not bonding to it. So important to just read the instructions, check out the conditions you're painting in, particularly if it's outside, and make sure that you let that nature take its courses, dry properly, and then you get the next coat on there to get that great finish. If you have got peeling paint on your surface, again, remove it all, sand down what is loose and peeling. Don't try and paint over surfaces you think, oh, this is 50-50 bonded. It's only going to compromise itself, because as the other paint's drying on top, you'll actually peel the other coat off. So unfortunately, if you've got a peeling paint phenomena, best thing is to try and scrape, heat gun, or sand it right off, wipe it down, get rid of all the dust particles, prep seal it, and then start again and paint on top. And our final problem that we have seen comes up is wrinkling paint. Now this is not a common one, but it gets to those anxious ones at times where it happens from a few things. So you'll see that photo on the screen now with wrinkling. That wrinkling paint can happen if you try and put a thick coat on it once, and what happens is you get the top of the paint drying faster than the bottom, and you get that wrinkling phenomena, and once it's there it doesn't go away. The other thing is, particularly in warmer climates, we've had customers up in Queensland and up in Northern Territory, particularly outside, but here in the summertime as well, down the southern parts of Australia, is if you are in hot conditions, you need to be aware of the instructions on the paint can on the surface temperature, not ambient. If it says that you apply the paint to something like between 10 and 30 degrees, that's the surface temperature. You might be outside on a day where it's 30 degrees, but the surface you're going over could be 40, 50 plus. And that's going to impact the way that the paint dries, and that can create that wrinkling phenomena. So really be aware of that, because once that happens, really there's no chance of just hoping that you can, it'll unwrinkle. It's just the way the film is. It's almost like a blanket on the top of the surface, and you can see those photos, that wrinkling phenomena. It's really ugly. And what can happen is you can actually have that top surface dry. When you remove it underneath, you can find there's still damp or wet paint below it, which is just that problem. And make sure you put 2 coats. Don't try and get one thick coat and cheap. You've got to take your time. A great paint job is done by the patient. Sistine Chapel was not done overnight. It took its time. Get it right with a couple of coats like Michelangelo did. You'll be right there. I think now we've just about finished this episode. Have we done that on this one? Wrinkling paint. We covered all our, lucky we got it all. Wrinkling paint, peeling paint, mould, and the flaking and cracking paint. Remember those. If you've got any other questions on these, please call us or email it through. Remember, you can subscribe to Monsta MTV. Those instructions are below there. We look forward to seeing you again next time. Thanks for joining us.